I had always prided myself on my resilience, on my hard-won, often painfully acquired ability to navigate the frequently treacherous, emotionally charged currents of life with a quiet, determined strength and an unwavering, if sometimes undeniably weary optimism. My name is Mia Hayes, and for the past 5 long, arduous, yet ultimately transformative years since the final agonizingly painful severing of a tumultuous, emotionally exhausting, and deeply damaging long-term relationship with a man named Thomas Ashton, I had meticulously, painstakingly, and with a fierce, protective maternal instinct, rebuilt my world and the world of my 2 precious children, 10-year-old Lily and 7-year-old Ben, from the smoldering bitter ashes of that particular romantic inferno. The man responsible for that earlier devastation, Thomas Ashton, was, I had fervently believed, a ghost, a phantom relegated to a previous, almost forgotten chapter of my life. A chapter I had slammed shut, double-bolted, and thrown away the key to. Our relationship, which had blossomed with the intoxicating, deceptive allure of a hothouse orchid in the heady, sun-drenched days of our early 20s, had over a period of nearly 7 years withered and died a slow, agonizing, and ultimately soul-crushing death. It culminated in his abrupt, callous, and utterly devastating departure at the very moment I needed him most, when I was navigating the treacherous, exhausting, and often terrifyingly isolating waters of early motherhood with a colicky-demanding newborn Lily, and simultaneously trying with a desperation born of necessity to salvage my then fledgling freelance writing career after a series of unforeseen and financially crippling professional setbacks had rocked our already fragile domestic stability. He had promised me the world-whispered vows of undying, eternal love and unwavering, unconditional support under starlit summer skies. And then, when the mundane, unglamorous responsibilities of parenthood became too burdensome, when the sacrifices required for a shared life became too personally demanding, when my own legitimate emotional needs and professional aspirations too inconveniently, too assertively asserted themselves, he had simply vanished. There was no dramatic, tearful farewell scene, no heartfelt if painful explanations, no attempt at a shared respectful uncoupling. Just a curt, impersonal, almost dismissive note left carelessly on the kitchen counter beside a stack of unpaid bills, and then an echoing, deafening, and utterly soul-destroying silence that had for a very long, very dark, and very lonely time consumed my days and relentlessly haunted my sleepless, tear-soaked nights. But I had, against all odds, against my own initial paralyzing despair, survived. More than survived, I had, through a combination of sheer, bloody-minded willpower, the unwavering, unconditional love for my 2 innocent children, and the occasional life-affirming kindness of a few true steadfast friends, managed to not just endure, but to, in my own quiet, unassuming way, actually thrive. I had poured every ounce of my being, every shred of my often flagging resilience, into raising Lily and Ben, into creating a stable, loving, and nurturing home for them, a sanctuary meticulously shielded as much as humanly possible from the lingering toxic shadows of their father's casual, devastating abandonment. I had worked tirelessly, often juggling multiple disparate freelance writing and editing assignments, sacrificing my own needs, my own desires, my own precious fleeting moments of potential leisure to ensure they never felt deprived, never felt the sharp stinging and deeply shaming deprivations of true insecurity that had for a period been my own constant unwelcome companion. And I believed, largely succeeded. Our small, rented but cozy and lovingly decorated suburban home, while certainly not a palace of opulence, was, I fervently believed, filled with warmth, with laughter, with the comforting, sometimes wonderfully chaotic energy of a happy, well-adjusted, and deeply loved family. My freelance career, after years of relentless, often solitary effort, late nights, fueled by lukewarm coffee and sheer determination, was finally blessedly beginning to flourish, providing us with a comfortable, if not extravagant, and increasingly stable living. I had, with a quiet internal pride that needed no external validation, built a new life, a good life, a life predicated entirely on my own strength, my own integrity, my own unwavering, almost ferocious commitment to my children. The memories of Thomas Ashton, though still capable on rare, unguarded, and usually unwelcome occasions, a snatch of an old song on the radio, the scent of his once familiar cologne on a passing stranger, a dreamlike image surfacing unbidden from the depths of my subconscious, of eliciting a faint ghost-like pang of old familiar hurt, a dull ache of remembered betrayal, had I genuinely, fervently, and with a profound sense of hard-won relief, believed largely, almost entirely faded into the muted, sepia-toned, and blessedly distant landscape of a concluded and firmly, irrevocably, bolted shut past. I told myself with a conviction I desperately, almost fiercely, wanted to believe was absolute well and truly, and finally moved on. Life, as they say, and as I had so often and so stoically, so determinedly reminded myself during the darkest, most challenging, and most lonely days of single motherhood, simply and wonderfully had to go on. Or so I naively, foolishly, and as it would soon be devastatingly, almost comically revealed to me, entirely comprehensively, erroneously believed. It was a bleak, rain-lashed, and utterly miserable Tuesday evening in late November, the kind of relentless, soul-dampening evening that chills you to the very bone and makes the very idea of venturing out from the warm, dry sanctuary of one's home into the storm-tossed, unwelcoming world outside utterly, completely unthinkable. The children, Lily and Ben, were thankfully safely tucked into their beds, their soft, even innocent breathing a comforting rhythmic counterpoint to the angry percussive drumming of the rain against our living room window panes. I was curled up with a profound sense of well-earned exhaustion on our comfortable, slightly worn but much-loved sofa in our small, cozy living room, a steaming, fragrant mug of chamomile tea clutched comfortingly in my hands, a half-read, engrossing novel lying open, momentarily forgotten in my lap. I was finally blessedly allowing myself a few precious stolen moments of quiet, uninterrupted adult solitude, a rare and deeply cherished commodity in my usually so hectic, child-centered existence. And then the doorbell rang, a sharp, sudden, almost aggressively insistent peal that shattered the fragile, comforting stillness of the stormy night, sending a jolt of unwelcome, inexplicable adrenaline coursing through my veins. My first thought, a fleeting, irrational flicker of maternal anxiety, was for the children. Had something happened? Were they all right? But their soft, rhythmic breathing from their nearby bedrooms continued undisturbed. My next thought, more prosaic, was that it was perhaps a late misdirected delivery or a neighbor needing to borrow something in an emergency. With a sigh of mild, weary annoyance at the interruption, I reluctantly uncurled myself from the sofa, placed my cooling tea and my forgotten novel on the coffee table, and padded in my comfortable worn slippers towards the front door. I peered through the small, distorting peephole, my heart giving a sudden, inexplicable lurch of something. Unease, apprehension, or perhaps a faint, almost subliminal premonition of impending unwelcome and potentially life-altering disruption. Standing on my small, rain-swept porch, illuminated by the flickering, uncertain glow of the porch light, looking older, undeniably more careworn, his usually so confident shoulders slightly stooped, his expensive tailored overcoat soaked through and clinging uncharacteristically to his now somewhat thinner frame, his handsome, once so beloved and now so hauntingly familiar face etched with lines of weariness, of anxiety, and of something that looked in the dim, distorting light remarkably, almost shockingly like genuine, profound remorse, was Thomas Ashton, my ex, the ghost from my buried past, the man who had 5 long, agonizing years ago shattered my heart, betrayed my trust, and callously, devastatingly abandoned me and our infant daughter. He was back, and he was standing on my doorstep. For a long, suspended, almost breathless moment, I simply stared, my mind reeling, my heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against my ribs, a maelstrom of conflicting, tumultuous emotions. shock certainly, disbelief absolutely, a sudden unwelcome surge of old familiar anger, and beneath it all, a tiny, treacherous, and deeply unsettling flicker of something else, something I couldn't or perhaps wouldn't immediately name. "Mia," he said, his voice, when it finally came, low, hoarse, almost hesitant, a stark, shocking contrast to the confident, often arrogant timbre I remembered so vividly, so painfully. "Mia, it's me, Thomas. Can I come in? Please, just for a few minutes. We really need to talk." His words, his unexpected, almost surreal presence on my doorstep after all these years of silence, of absence, of carefully constructed emotional distance felt like a physical blow, a sudden brutal intrusion into the safe, stable, and hard-won sanctuary of my new life. The life I had so painstakingly, so resiliently rebuilt from the ashes of the one he had so casually, so cruelly destroyed. I didn't respond immediately. My mind, my emotions were racing, a chaotic jumble of past hurts, present anxieties, and a dawning, terrifying uncertainty about what this sudden, unwelcome resurrection of a ghost from my past could possibly mean for me, for my children, for the fragile peace I had fought so incredibly hard to achieve. Part of me, the wounded, still angry part, wanted to slam the door in his face, to scream at him to leave, to disappear back into the shadows from whence he had so unexpectedly, so audaciously emerged. But another part, a quieter, more cautious, perhaps even a foolishly, dangerously curious part, hesitated. What did he want? Why now? After all these years of silence, of apparent indifference, what could possibly have brought Thomas Ashton, the man who had once promised me the world, and then so casually, so cruelly, taken it all away back to my doorstep on this dark, stormy, and suddenly very ominous November night? I don't know why you're here. Thomas, I finally managed to say, my voice to my own surprise, steady, calm almost, detached, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within me. It's been a very long time, and whatever it is you think we need to talk about, I'm not sure I have anything left to say to you, or anything I particularly want to hear. He looked taken aback visibly by my cool, almost dismissive response, by the absence of the tearful emotional reaction he had perhaps in his arrogance anticipated, or even perversely hoped for. But he quickly, almost too quickly, recovered his handsome face, morphing into an expression of profound, almost theatrical remorse. "Mia, please," he implored, his voice now laced with a carefully calibrated note of desperate, heartfelt sincerity. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I hurt you terribly, more than you can possibly imagine. And I have lived with that guilt, that regret, every single day for the past 5 years. I made mistakes, Mia. Horrible, unforgivable mistakes. I was a fool, a coward, but I've changed. I truly have. And I just want a chance, just one small chance to apologize, to try and make things right, to perhaps, if it's not too late, if you could ever find it in your heart, to ask for another chance." Another chance. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it, after everything he had put me through, after the years of silence, of neglect, of my solitary, often desperate struggle to raise our daughter, to rebuild my shattered life, almost made me laugh out loud, a harsh, bitter, incredulous sound. But I didn't. I simply stared at him, at this ghost from my past, this unwelcome harbinger of potential new chaos, my mind, racing, my heart, a cold, hard knot of suspicion, of resentment, and of a dawning, deeply unsettling premonition that his sudden, dramatic reappearance, his carefully rehearsed contrition, was not by any stretch of the imagination as simple or as altruistic as he was so desperately, so charmingly trying to make it seem. The past, it seemed, was not nearly as buried or as benign as I had so foolishly, so hopefully allowed myself to believe. And Thomas Ashton, I sensed with a chilling, visceral certainty, was not here merely to apologize. He was here because he wanted something. And I, Mia Hayes, was no longer the naive, trusting, easily manipulated young woman he had so callously, so cruelly left behind. The truth was, despite my carefully constructed facade of cool, detached indifference, Thomas Ashton's sudden dramatic reappearance on my rain-lashed doorstep after 5 long, arduous years of silence had undeniably thrown my carefully reassembled world, my hard-won emotional equilibrium, into a state of profound, disorienting turmoil. I had worked so incredibly hard, with such relentless, often solitary determination, to move on from the wreckage of our shattered relationship, to build a new stable and fulfilling life for myself and for our children, Lily and Ben, a life in which Thomas played no part, held no sway, evoked no lingering, debilitating emotion beyond a dull residual ache of remembered betrayal. And now, here he was, a ghost from a past I thought I had successfully, definitively exorcised, standing before me, looking older, undeniably more careworn, yet still possessing that same damnably familiar, almost boyish charm that had once long ago so completely, so disastrously captivated my foolish, unsuspecting heart. He was stirring up emotions, memories, vulnerabilities I thought I had buried deep, deep down under layers of scar tissue and hard-won resilience. Against my better judgment, against every screaming instinct of self-preservation, honed by years of his past deceptions, I found myself after a long, tense, and emotionally charged standoff on my doorstep reluctantly, almost against my own will, stepping aside, allowing him entry into the warmth, the sanctuary of my home. A home he had never before seen, a home I had built entirely without him, a home that was a testament to my own strength, my own independence. Perhaps it was the relentless driving rain. Perhaps it was a flicker of some long-forgotten, deeply buried ember of pity for the pathetic, rain-soaked figure he cut. Or perhaps, more honestly, it was a dangerous, insidious cocktail of morbid curiosity and a foolish, treacherous, entirely unwelcome whisper of hope. A hope that perhaps, just perhaps, people could change, that remorse could be genuine, that second chances, however improbable, however undeserved, might still exist in this often harsh and unforgiving world. You can't just come back into my life like this, Thomas, after all these years, after everything that happened, and expect things to just magically go back to normal. I said, my voice, despite my best efforts to keep it steady, trembling almost imperceptibly as I led him into our small, cozy living room, a room filled with the comforting, everyday clutter of family life. Lily's art supplies scattered on the coffee table. Ben's soccer cleats kicked haphazardly by the door, the faint, lingering scent of the chili I had cooked for dinner. This was my life now. Our life, a life he had no part in. No right to disrupt. You left Thomas. You walked away. You hurt me. You hurt Lily more than you can possibly imagine. I'm not the same person I was back then. We're not the same. Thomas stood silently in the center of the room for a long moment, his gaze sweeping slowly, almost assessingly over the unfamiliar surroundings, over the framed photographs of Lily and Ben that adorned the mantelpiece, photographs in which he, their father, was conspicuously, tellingly absent. Guilt, genuine or feigned, was written all over his handsome, rain-slicked features. He looked, I had to admit, utterly, comprehensively miserable. He didn't offer any immediate excuses, any defensive justifications for his past actions. He simply nodded his eyes, those deep blue eyes that had once held such power over me, now filled with an expression of profound, almost heartbreaking sadness. He didn't in that moment have a good enough reason, a plausible explanation for what he had done, for the devastation he had wrought. He was just here. A ghost materialized. Asking it seemed not for forgiveness, not yet, but simply for an audience. For a chance to speak his piece, however belated, however self-serving it might ultimately prove to be. And so over the next few weeks, a bizarre, unsettling, and emotionally fraught new chapter in my life with Thomas Ashton began. He didn't try to force himself back into my home or into my bed, thankfully, but he became a persistent, almost relentless presence on the periphery of my existence. There were daily phone calls, his voice always laced with that new unfamiliar note of humility, of heartfelt remorse. There were long, rambling emails filled with eloquent, if somewhat theatrical expressions of his profound regret, his dawning self-awareness, his supposed transformation from the selfish, emotionally stunted man he admitted he had once been into a new, more mature, more empathetic, more deserving version of himself. He sent flowers, small, thoughtful, and no doubt carefully chosen gifts for Lily and Ben, gifts I initially warily intercepted, unsure of how or even if I should present them to the children who had only the vaguest, most distant, and largely negative memories of him. He would accidentally bump into me at the local coffee shop at the grocery store, his demeanor always one of respectful deference, of quiet, hopeful contrition. He spoke at length and with a sincerity that, despite my ingrained cynicism, I found increasingly difficult to entirely dismiss, about how difficult, how empty, how meaningless his life had been in the 5 years since our separation. He confessed with a candor that was both disarming and deeply unsettling that he had made a string of terrible mistakes in his career, his financial investments having apparently soured dramatically. He alluded vaguely, but with a palpable air of self-pity, to a series of unfulfilling, superficial relationships that had only served to highlight the profound, irreplaceable loss of what he now belatedly claimed to realize he had once shared with me. True love, genuine partnership, a real family. He painted a picture of a man adrift, a man who had lost his way, a man who had finally painfully come to recognize the true enduring value of what he had so recklessly, so foolishly thrown away. He needed me. He insisted, not just as a former lover, but as a friend, as a confidant, as someone, perhaps the only someone who had ever truly understood him, truly seen him, and who might, just might, be capable of guiding him back towards a path of redemption, of wholeness. And I, Mia Hayes, the woman who had sworn to herself 1,000 times over that she would never, ever allow Thomas Ashton to hurt her again, found myself, to my own profound, almost horrified bewilderment, beginning to listen, to soften, to dare, I even admit it to myself, feel a flicker, just a tiny, treacherous, and entirely unwelcome spark of something. Not love, certainly not. That, well, I was convinced, had run irrevocably, blessedly dry. But perhaps a sliver of pity, a touch of that old familiar and deeply ingrained desire to fix, to heal, to nurture, that had always been both my greatest strength and my most profound, exploitable weakness. He was, I had to admit, undeniably, damnably persuasive. His apologies seemed heartfelt. His remorse, at least on the surface, appeared genuine. And the loneliness, the gnawing, often unbearable loneliness of single parenthood, of navigating the world as a solo act after years of a shared, albeit often dysfunctional partnership, was a constant, wearying reality in my own life. The thought, however fleeting, however foolish, of perhaps, just perhaps, having an adult companion again, a co-parent for Lily and Ben, a shared presence in our quiet, sometimes too quiet home, was a seductive, if deeply dangerous siren song. But even as a small, foolish part of my heart dared to entertain the improbable notion of his genuine transformation, another far larger, far wiser, and infinitely more cynical part of me, the part that bore the deep, indelible scars of his past betrayals, remained intensely, unshakably wary. Something about his sudden dramatic reappearance, about the almost too perfect, too rehearsed nature of his contrition, about the subtle but persistent undertones of desperation in his voice, didn't quite sit right. It felt off, calculated, almost predatory. The internal conflict raged within me, a silent, exhausting tug of war between my ingrained desire to believe in the possibility of redemption, to perhaps recapture some lost, idealized version of family for my children, and the cold, hard, experiential wisdom that screamed with an almost frantic urgency, "Danger! Fool me once, shame on you! Fool me twice." It was during one of his increasingly frequent and increasingly lengthy "let's just talk as old friends." phone calls a call ostensibly about his ongoing struggles to find a new career path, and his deepening understanding of his past emotional failings, that the first truly jarring, discordant note was struck a note so out of tune with his carefully crafted symphony of remorse that it sent a shiver of genuine ice-cold alarm down my spine. He had been lamenting with his usual practiced air of self-deprecating woe his current dire financial straits, the result, he claimed, of a series of catastrophically unlucky investments and the betrayal of a trusted business partner. He then, with a casualness that was clearly anything but mentioned almost as an afterthought, that he was facing an imminent and rather significant tax bill that he simply had no earthly idea how he was going to pay. He quickly, almost too quickly, brushed it aside, assuring me he wasn't asking for anything. Of course, not Mia, never that. But the seed, the insidious manipulative seed, had been planted. A few days later, during another accidental coffee shop encounter, he steered the conversation with a subtlety that was almost admirable in its cunning towards my own, now relatively stable and modestly successful, freelance graphic design business. He expressed such profound, almost paternal admiration for my incredible resilience, my impressive entrepreneurial spirit, my ability to build something so wonderful all on my own after everything. He then, with a feigned, almost boyish enthusiasm, began to ask increasingly specific, and I now realized deeply inappropriate questions about my client base, my income streams, my business savings, my long-term financial projections. "You must be doing quite well for yourself now, Mia," he'd said, his eyes, those keen, appraising blue eyes, holding a new, unfamiliar, and distinctly unsettling gleam of, was it avarice or just a desperate opportunistic curiosity? "It's wonderful to see you so secure, so successful." The compliments, once so disarming, now felt cloying, predatory. His interest in my finances, once perhaps interpretable as friendly concern, now felt invasive, calculated. The unease, the vague, intuitive suspicions I had been trying so hard to suppress began to solidify, to coalesce into a cold, hard, and increasingly undeniable certainty. Thomas Ashton hadn't just changed. He hadn't just seen the error of his ways. He hadn't just missed me and the children. No. Thomas Ashton. I was beginning to fear, with a sickening dawning horror had come back into my life, not because he loved me, not because he regretted losing me, but because he was broke, because he was desperate, and because he once again needed something from me. And that something, I suspected with a chilling visceral prescience, was my hard-earned money. That night, after another one of his increasingly cloying, "I've learned so much, I'm a new man," phone calls, a call that had yet again somehow almost imperceptibly veered towards a discussion of his temporary but rather pressing financial embarrassments. I made a decision. I couldn't. I wouldn't allow myself to be fooled again, to be manipulated again, to be a pawn in his selfish, destructive games. My heart, however foolishly, treacherously tempted it might be by the illusion of a mended past of a reconstituted family, was not going to overrule my head, my hard-won experiential wisdom this time. I decided with a cold, almost clinical detachment to do some discreet but thorough digging of my own. I still had a few mutual acquaintances from our old life together, people who had for the most part sided with me, or at least maintained a sympathetic neutrality after our acrimonious breakup. I remembered with a sudden guilty jolt, still had access to a few of his old long-forgotten social media profiles he had likely assumed I had long since blocked or forgotten about, profiles that might offer a less curated, less performative glimpse into his actual life over the past 5 years. What I uncovered over the next few late soul-destroying nights of clandestine online sleuthing and a few carefully worded discreet phone calls to old trusted friends was not just shocking. It was in its sheer, unadulterated, and almost breathtakingly arrogant duplicity, utterly comprehensively devastating. Thomas Ashton hadn't just made some mistakes in his career. He had, it turned out, left a veritable trail of financial destruction, of broken promises of embittered former business partners, and most damningly of other similarly trusting and similarly exploited women in his wake. His catastrophically unlucky investments were in reality a series of reckless high-stakes gambles in shady, unregulated offshore schemes. His betrayal by a trusted business partner was, according to two very angry, very vocal, and very credible sources, actually his betrayal of them a case of him absconding with their shared investment capital. And his series of unfulfilling superficial relationships, they were, it seemed, a string of calculated predatory entanglements with vulnerable, often recently divorced or widowed women of means, women from whom he had, with his practiced charm and his well-honed tales of woe, successfully borrowed, or rather extorted, significant sums of money that was invariably never ever repaid. He wasn't just a failed businessman. He was a serial con artist, a financial predator, a man who used his charm, his looks, his intelligence as weapons to exploit the trust, the kindness, the financial resources of unsuspecting, vulnerable women. And I, Mia Hayes, his first wife, the mother of his children, was. It seemed simply his latest, or rather his revisited target. He hadn't come back because he missed me, or because he loved me, or because he genuinely regretted his past actions. He had come back because he was broke, because he was desperate, because he had likely exhausted all his other more recent avenues of financial exploitation. He had come back because he saw me in my hard-won stability, in my modest but growing professional success, in my still perhaps foolishly forgiving heart, as his last, best, and most easily manipulated hope, as his potential unsuspecting and entirely undeserving financial lifeline, as his next and perhaps, in his arrogant, narcissistic mind, his easiest victim. The realization hit me not with the force of a sudden, unexpected blow, but with the slow, sickening, inexorable certainty of a terminal diagnosis. He wasn't sorry for hurting me. He was only sorry because he once again needed something from me, and that something was, as it had always been, all about him and absolutely unequivocally nothing at all about me or about our children. The chilling, irrefutable truth of Thomas Ashton's predatory nature, his systematic, almost sociopathic pattern of financial and emotional exploitation settled upon me, not with the fiery rage of my initial long-ago heartbreak, but with a cold, hard, almost diamond-like clarity, a clarity that was both terrifying in its implications and strangely, unexpectedly empowering. The lingering vestiges of my foolish, treacherous hope for his genuine redemption, for some semblance of a mended past, dissolved, completely replaced by a steely, unwavering resolve. I would not be his victim again. I would not allow him to manipulate me to exploit my hard-won financial security, to disrupt the fragile peace I had so painstakingly, so resiliently rebuilt for myself and for my children. But neither I decided with a new, almost chilling strategic calm would I simply slam the door in his face, metaphorically or literally, and allow him to just slink away to find his next unsuspecting target, to continue his destructive parasitic charade. No. This time, Thomas Ashton was not just going to be rejected. He was going to be exposed. He was going to face a reckoning. And I, Mia Hayes, the woman he had so grievously wronged, the woman he so clearly, so contemptuously underestimated, was going to be the architect of that long overdue and richly, richly deserved public unmasking. My first and most crucial step was to meticulously, almost clinically gather and organize the evidence of his current duplicitous intentions towards me, and where possible to corroborate it with the evidence of his past similar predatory behaviors towards other women. I carefully saved every cloying, manipulative email he had sent me, every text message filled with his feigned remorse and his subtle probing inquiries about my financial status. I transcribed with a lawyer's precision the key self-incriminating segments from our recorded phone conversations, highlighting his inconsistencies, his contradictions, his increasingly desperate, transparent attempts to elicit my sympathy and ultimately my financial assistance. Then, with the invaluable, if initially reluctant assistance of one of his other more recent and equally embittered victims, a woman named Sarah, a successful small business owner whom he had charmed, defrauded, and then callously discarded just a few months prior. A woman whose own story, when she finally tearfully shared it with me after I cautiously reached out to her, mirrored my own past experiences with Thomas with an almost eerie, horrifying precision. We began to build a more comprehensive and infinitely more damning dossier. Sarah, fueled by her own righteous anger and a desire to prevent Thomas from harming anyone else, provided me with copies of her own financial records, her own incriminating email exchanges with him, even a few rather pathetic love letters he had written. Her letters filled with the same tired, recycled protestations of undying devotion and shared, glittering futures that he had once so convincingly spun for me. Armed with this growing, irrefutable arsenal of evidence that painted a clear, undeniable picture of Thomas Ashton not as a reformed, remorseful penitent, but as a calculating, predatory, and entirely unrepentant serial con artist, I knew it was time to move beyond quiet investigation and into the realm of direct, decisive, and potentially very public confrontation. But I wasn't going to do it alone, and I wasn't going to do it emotionally. This time, I was going to be strategic. I was going to be legal. I scheduled another meeting with Thomas again at that same quiet, anonymous downtown coffee shop where we had had our previous unsettling encounters. I told him with a carefully feigned, almost hopeful tremor in my voice that I had been doing a lot of thinking about his situation, about our past, and that I was perhaps beginning to consider the possibility of helping him get back on his feet. I could almost hear the predatory gleam in his voice over the phone as he eagerly, almost too eagerly, agreed to meet. He clearly thought his manipulative charm, his well-honed performance of contrition, was finally successfully working its magic on his soft-hearted, forgiving ex-wife. He had once again profoundly, and as it would soon turn out, fatally underestimated me. When Thomas Ashton swaggered into that coffee shop the following afternoon, his demeanor noticeably more confident, more self-assured than it had been during our previous, more tentative encounters, his eyes already alight with a greedy, anticipatory gleam, he found not just me, Mia Hayes, waiting for him at our usual secluded corner table. Beside me, looking calm, professional, and radiating an almost palpable aura of quiet, steely legal authority sat Ms. Eleanor Vance, my new and incredibly formidable lawyer, a woman renowned for her sharp intellect, her aggressive litigation style, and her particular and rather gleeful expertise in cases involving financial fraud and an A-list of very publicly shamed and financially ruined white-collar criminals. And on the table between us, not a checkbook, not a loan agreement, but a thick, ominous-looking and very official legal binder, its cover emblazoned with the stark, uncompromising title, Preliminary Findings Financial Investigation into the Activities of Mr. Thomas Ashton. The look of stunned, incredulous, almost comical disbelief that flashed across Thomas Ashton's handsome, suddenly very pale face as he registered Ms. Vance's presence as his gaze fell upon that damning, unexpected binder was, I confess, one of the most profoundly, almost shamefully satisfying moments of my entire long and often very painful adult life. His confident swagger vanished instantly, replaced by a look of dawning, horrified comprehension, then by a wave of pure, unadulterated, almost animalistic panic. He looked in that moment like a cornered, terrified rat, suddenly realizing that the enticing piece of cheese he had been so confidently, so arrogantly approaching was in fact attached to a very large, very lethal, and entirely inescapable legal trap. The confrontation that followed was not loud, not overtly dramatic, at least not on our side of the table. Ms. Vance, with a calm, almost surgical precision and an icy, unwavering politeness that was in its own way far more terrifying than any emotional outburst could ever have been proceeded to systematically, relentlessly lay bare the entirety of Thomas Ashton's deceitful, predatory life. She presented him with copies of his own incriminating emails, his recorded lies, his fraudulent financial statements. She detailed his history of exploiting vulnerable women, his pattern of calculated charm followed by ruthless financial predation. She outlined the potential and very serious criminal charges he could be facing: fraud, theft by deception, possibly even extortion. And she concluded by informing him in no uncertain terms that unless he immediately agreed to cease and desist from any and all further contact with me, with my children, and with every other woman he had ever defrauded, a list she dryly noted that was according to their ongoing investigations, alarmingly and quite impressively extensive, and unless he also agreed in writing to a legally binding court-enforceable agreement to repay over a strictly defined and non-negotiable time frame every single penny he had ever borrowed or otherwise illicitly obtained from me and from Sarah and from every other identifiable victim they had thus far uncovered, she, Ms. Vance, was under my direct, unequivocal instructions to immediately forward their entire comprehensive and utterly damning investigative file, not only to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution, but also, and perhaps for a man as obsessed with his public image as Thomas Ashton, even more terrifyingly to every major news outlet, every influential social media blogger, every financial regulatory body in our city and beyond. Thomas Ashton, faced with the irrefutable, overwhelming evidence of his own perfidy, with the very real, very public and professionally, socially, and financially ruinous threat of utter comprehensive annihilation, didn't even attempt to deny, to bluster, to rationalize. He simply crumbled. He sat there, a pale, trembling, sweating wreck of a man, his handsome face a mask of abject terror, his eyes darting around the quiet, anonymous coffee shop as if searching desperately for an escape route that no longer in any meaningful sense existed. The predator, so confident, so arrogant, so accustomed to his own impunity, had finally, irrevocably been cornered, unmasked, and utterly, comprehensively defeated. The lesson was not delivered with anger or with hate or with a desire for vengeance, though God knows I had at various dark moments felt all of those corrosive emotions. It was delivered with the cold, hard, and ultimately far more powerful and far more lasting weight of truth, of evidence, of justice. And as I watched Thomas Ashton, my former lover, my one-time nemesis, visibly, almost physically shrink under the unyielding, unforgiving glare of that truth, as I saw his carefully constructed world of lies and illusion shatter into a million irreparable pieces around him, I didn't feel triumph, not in the way I had once imagined I might. Instead, what I felt was a profound, almost weary sense of closure, and a quiet, unshakable, and deeply empowering understanding that I, Mia Hayes, was no longer his victim. I was finally, blessedly, and irrevocably free. The aftermath of that final devastating confrontation in the quiet, anonymous coffee shop was in its own way as transformative for me, Mia Hayes, as the initial agonizing discovery of Thomas Ashton's betrayal had been. He, as expected, and as strongly advised by his now thoroughly alarmed and undoubtedly very frustrated lawyer, Mr. Greenbaum, signed everything Ms. Vance put in front of him. The legally binding cease and desist order, the comprehensive repayment agreement, the terms of which were, I knew, so stringent, so demanding, that they would likely ensure he spent the rest of his natural life in a state of perpetual and richly deserved financial penury. Even a humiliating, though largely symbolic, written apology to me and to Sarah for the profound emotional distress and financial hardship his regrettable actions had caused. He then, true to his cowardly, self-serving nature, effectively vanished from my life, and I hoped from the lives of all his other victims. Like a puff of smoke, a bad dream finally, blessedly exorcised. I never saw him again. I occasionally heard through the distant, almost indifferent whispers of old shared acquaintances, vague, unconfirmed rumors of his drastically diminished circumstances, of his having to sell his flashy sports car, of his being forced to move into a cramped, rundown apartment in a less than salubrious part of town, of his struggling to find even menial, low-paying employment, his once golden reputation, his once persuasive charm, now irrevocably tarnished, rendered utterly, laughably impotent by the quiet, persistent, and now widely disseminated through discreet, informal channels, of coarse truth of his predatory, duplicitous nature. I took no particular pleasure in these reports, no vindictive satisfaction. His downfall was his own doing, the inevitable, inexorable consequence of a life built on a foundation of lies, deceit, and the exploitation of others. My only emotion when I thought of him at all, which was thankfully with an increasing, liberating rarity, was a kind of weary, detached pity and a profound, almost overwhelming gratitude for my own hard-won escape. My true victory, my most meaningful revenge, was not in his ruin, but in my own and my children's phoenix-like resurrection. The money he was now grudgingly and under constant legal threat beginning to repay, while certainly welcome. And legally, mine was in the grand scheme of things almost incidental. What truly mattered, what I had truly fought for, and what I had against all odds reclaimed was something far more precious, far more fundamental. My dignity, my self-respect, my peace of mind, and above all, the absolute, unshakable security of my children's future, a future that would now be built not on the shifting, treacherous sands of a man's broken promises and deceitful illusions, but on the solid, unyielding bedrock of their mother's strength, resilience, integrity, and unwavering, unconditional love. In the years that followed, I focused with a renewed, almost joyful energy on what truly mattered, on raising Lily and Ben to be kind, compassionate, discerning, and fiercely independent individuals, on nurturing my own, now thriving freelance graphic design career, a career that provided not just financial stability, but also a profound sense of personal accomplishment and creative fulfillment, and on rebuilding my own once so grievously wounded capacity for trust, for joy, for connection, not just with my children, but with the wider world, with new friends, and eventually, cautiously, with the possibility of a new, healthier, and far more authentic kind of love. I learned through this excruciating, yet ultimately empowering ordeal that forgiveness, forgiveness isn't about letting the other person off the hook, isn't about excusing their inexcusable actions, isn't about forgetting the pain they inflicted. It's about freeing yourself. It's about releasing the toxic, corrosive burden of anger, of resentment, of victimhood from your own heart, from your own soul, so that you can finally truly move forward, unencumbered, into the bright, open promise of your own reclaimed future. And I learned perhaps the most important lesson of all, that true love, true partnership isn't about grand, empty promises or superficial, charming facades. It's about integrity. It's about respect. It's about shared values, mutual support, and an unwavering, unshakable commitment to honesty, even and especially when it's difficult. And that I knew with every fiber of my being was the kind of love, the kind of life I truly deserved, the kind of example I wanted to set for my children, the kind of quiet, authentic, and deeply fulfilling happiness I would from that day forward never ever settle for anything less than. The ghost of regrets past had finally truly been laid to rest, and the future, my future, our future, stretched before us, bright open and blessedly, wonderfully free.